Hi all, thanks for your patience. I had trouble getting the software to load earlier, and I've had to just go back and re-record. It's no big deal. I do want to comment on this last article that I'll ever record about Loftus and Davis. I really enjoy it. In this case, and I think this is a very influential, very valuable article that Loftus wrote, obviously, I would say probably 11 years ago in 2005, where she and Davis get specific about the nature of false memories and in some cases concede um, that repressed memories might exist. It's not the case that absolutely everyone is considered to be bunk, as some may exist. So they offer some qualifiers there, and I think that's important to acknowledge. So this opening salvo that they mentioned about George Franklin arrested for the murder of his daughter, based on her testimony 20 years later. And we also have, of course, the idea of recovered memories during therapy that have led to allegations of sexual abuse. And again, I want to be careful not to suggest that every time that someone makes an allegation of that sort that is presumed to be false. That's not the way we treat things. That's not the way law enforcement handles things. But in tandem with legitimate complaints were situations in which there were manufactured memories, and a lot of them in therapy, that led to false allegations. So Loftus at the beginning of this article is writing for a presumed, I wouldn't say ignorant audience, but one that could use a refresher on the times from which this comes. So the bottom few sentences there. Typically, these accusations arose on the basis of memories that adult children had recovered during therapy. Some mental health professionals were even promoting the notion that numerous victims had experienced horrific satanic ritual abuse about which they were harboring repressed memories. Loftus returns to this idea of satanic ritualized abuse. Again, being careful. We don't want to say that that's never happened in human history, but the extremity of that sort of abuse, that often, by its description, involves murder, is unlikely to happen very often, because attendant with that, we would have missing persons and deceased bodies and skeletons and unimaginable carnage. So we have to assume it happens seldom and is wildly out of proportion with the number of memories that ostensibly remember those sort of things. So that is a critical thing to bear in mind, of how infrequently those things are presumed to occur, but how often they're invoked in therapy and other places. So scholarly analyses, which she would describe herself as being scholarly, and other cognitive psychologists that disagree strongly with these lines of assertion, were revealing that there was little in the way of support for widespread assumptions among therapists and in popular folklore that traumatic memories are particularly likely, relative to non-traumatic memories, to be repressed. So, frankly, they just don't believe it, that these memories are repressed very often. And there are particular things that are qualifiers for when we might trust a repressed memory versus when we might not. So therapists, as she says, who supported this position of repressed memories existing, tended to view the incidence of repressed memories of abuse as relatively high, and therefore the frequency with which such memories were recovered in therapy as unsurprising. So if it's a very pervasive phenomenon, I'm not surprised when people recover the memories in therapy. Many such therapies also viewed even extremely bizarre claims, again, such as satanic ritual abuse among children and adults, as credible, when in fact, for those things to be true, they would frankly leave evidence. They would leave a lot of evidence. And finally, they argued that false memories for such events were particularly unlikely. So we had a bit of a crisis between, say, 1990 and 95, give or take, in which there was an active fight against, you could describe, well-intentioned people, whereas the therapists were strongly suggesting I shouldn't say the therapists, some proportion of them were strongly suggesting one thing, and psychologists, cognitive psychologists, were suggesting another. So one last thing. On the other side were the clinical, social, and cognitive researchers who had long studied the fallibility of memory, beginning with the assumption that, if anything, memories for trauma are stronger than are those for ordinary events. In other words, we have trouble putting them down. These scholars and scientists found no compelling evidence that people massively repress sex abuse and then reliably recover the memories later. So she mentions often in her career this idea of being plagued with unwanted memories coming to the forefront about traumas that one has experienced. There was a movie that was released in 1981 starring Sylvester Stallone called First Blood. It was the first of the Rambo series. Now, the Rambo movies and their later iterations and the sequels were sort of just somewhat empty action movies, but the very first movie honestly has just a tremendous, many redeeming qualities. It's very, very well done, and it depicts, in Sylvester's case, a 35-year-old Vietnam veteran who is not doing well. He's homeless and drifting from town to town, and runs into a hostile sheriff. And the bottom line is he's a greatly traumatized Vietnam era veteran from about 12 to 14 years prior. So, which would have been, of course, late 60s, mid 60s. And the one thing Sylvester Stallone does depict very well in that movie is that he can't put down the memories. He cannot get away from them. So you could argue that some of these action movies are fairly vapid, but that particular movie is exceptionally well done. It's a very good depiction, in my opinion, of this idea of traumatic memories not just being repressed, but actively plaguing the person that holds the memory. A key distinction for your comprehension exercise: prospective versus retrospective studies. One of these deals with people that are known to have been abused and therefore are frankly more interesting. The other of the two deals only on the testimony of allegedly abused people. So you can imagine which one may serve the research better, and I'll let you read up on that. But this idea of a prospective versus retrospective study is a terribly compelling contrast. Also, we have case studies. A third source of evidence offered to support the claim of massive repression are anecdotal cases, in other words, just individual cases. But one problem with a case history is that the therapist is typically the only person who has access to the person revealing their situation, and of course they're subjective in relaying that. And there's this lengthy anecdote about JR. They talk about this case history involving JR that you've probably read from Jonathan Schooler. Says that JR recovered his memory without a therapist, but JR was in therapy at the time. Schooler implies that JR had no motive, but he was actually a party to a lawsuit. Schooler was impressed that by a second individual who apparently also implied wrongdoing by a same priest, but that second individual was not independent because he came forth after learning about JR. And as these authors note, the case histories like that of JR do not meet two of the most important criteria for research: public control and replicability. So case histories are interesting stories, and they're not presumed to be false. I don't want to take that tack. But at the same time, they're just not verifiable in a lot of cases, and we have to be careful. So there's an author in Loftus and Davis that talks about verified case histories as described by Schooler. So for instance, in cases where we know a client came forward and spoke of abuse, and it appears to be the case that these were true cases of abuse. A few things were true. The memories were typically not recovered in therapy, and in all cases the moment of recovery was unrelated to therapy. The memories were triggered by external events that reminded the person of the original abuse. Once prompted, the memories completely unwound altogether. They came to the forefront. And the memories were mostly for single and not repeated events. The assailants were primarily non-family members, and the events dated from age 9 or older. In other words, this is outside the window of infantile amnesia, you might argue. So, retractors. There's also a piece of information in your text about people that held memories and then changed their mind. They reversed themselves and said, no, I don't believe I did this in the final analysis. In the 1990s, this is amazing, hundreds of individuals who had been persuaded that they repressed and recovered memories of abuse began to realize their memories were false, and many sued their former therapist for planting false memories. Scores were studied by psychologists trying to gain insight into the process by which the patients developed and later retracted their beliefs. Of course, that would be an interesting line of research. These studies revealed that the what they say the modal retractor, in other words, the most typically occurring sort of case, first sought therapy for depression and then recovered the memories of abuse during therapy. But later came to believe that memories were actually products of therapy itself. And more than 90% recovered their memories in therapy. And you can see some other remarkable statistics. 48% recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse. I mean, how many incidences of true satanic ritualized murder and mayhem have there been in the country in the last 25 years? I mean, it can't be that half of all clients are remembering something like that. Just really implausible. These are things that are not subtle and that the police would be involved with. Murder. 38% recovered memories of witnessing a murder. You think about that. What's attendant with witnessing a murder? Well, there's a record of a deceased person or a missing person. So, again, these are greatly inflated numbers relative to what's likely to be the case, with the police record. So, these retractors tell an interesting story, and among the other things, they tend to indict the therapy process itself as being the perpetrator of inflating these memories. So, again, not assuming that everything is false, but we have to begin to weigh these things. Okay, your author has another. These two authors have this passage about. Here we go. Pardon me, couldn't find it. Adopting and confirming belief in abuse. So, in the therapy session, how is it the case that the client believes that he or she has been abused, and the therapist is supporting that idea, adopting some sort of confirmation bias? Well, memory recovery procedures, as you'll read, that are sort of flimsy in their validity, hypnosis, guided imagery, dream interpretation, which Sigmund Freud would have approved of, but may have its own limited validity, family photos. Now, this is interesting. We read an article a ways back about people that when they saw real photographs were more inclined to believe something false that happened at the time period in which the photograph was taken, even if the photograph has not been altered in the least. So those family photos, even though they're real and even though they are unrelated nominally to the abuse itself, if they happen to come from the time period itself, we may consider that that it was an aid in engendering that. Two other things: repeated recall and abuse-related images and their misattribution as memory. So I've taken on photographs that are unrelated to my particular case, but I start to relay that. One other thing I'll just mention, and I think the article itself is terribly lucid. It reads well. She writes well. This is her living. And in fact, she's made a very handsome living at it. Who can resist the suggestion of these memories? Well, a person, frankly, that has more working memory capacity, more reasoning ability, may rise up and deal with this better. And the ability to exert one's will. If a person is more assertive, just has more command of themselves, and is just a more aggressive personality, then they may have found a motivation to resist. So these are aspects of people that have represented the exception to these rules. The subject matter that Loftus and Davis write about is grim. And again, I'm being very careful not to presume that any allegation of a crime is presumed to be false. That's not, morally the better path, of course. However, in tandem with legitimate complaints, there was a phenomenon of false allegations based on suggestion. So we hope it was sort of a fleeting historical episode that petered out 20 plus years ago, but this documentation of this phenomenon is fascinating. So I hope you'll enjoy this reading. The comprehension exercise 6 deals only with this article, and thank you for reading it.